Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I do appreciate you being with me. Hope your week is going really, really well. This is video number 6 in our continuing examination, review, and refutation of the book by my friend Steve Gregg, Why Not Full Preterism. Now, a little bit of a heads up and a little bit of warning, so to speak. What I'm going to cover today will only be a little bit of a snippet, as it were, of information and material that I will share a whole lot more in depth as we continue this investigation of Steve's book. On pages, what did I have? Okay. On pages 31 and following, and for several pages, Steve makes some of the most broad based comments and claims, presuppositional claims, I might add, that really, honestly, it's difficult to focus in on exactly which one to focus in on. Because, again, so many of his claims are presuppositional. And among those claims are on page 38, and he lists 5 things, essentially saying, well, clearly these things haven't taken place yet. And he is arguing strictly and solely from a presuppositional position. Now, he does begin on page 39 to sort of kind of vindicate his claim in regard pardon me, in regard to whether or not these things have taken place. And so I will discuss those things a little bit later on. But the subject of this particular video is Steve's explanation, Steve's claims in regard to the Greek word parousia. Steve said the Greek word parousia is a heavily nuanced word, and it can be used in a variety of ways. And he states that in such a way that he seems to think preterists are totally unaware of that. He even makes some claims that I must confess that even though I've gone over this information several times now, I find myself simply shaking my head. Number one, it took me a while. It took me a while to understand what it was Steve was claiming. Number two, I was amazed that he was making the claim. Now, he first of all points us to Daniel chapter 7, 13 and 14. I saw in the night vision one like unto the Son of Man, and he came before the Ancient of Days, and there was given unto him a kingdom and a power that shall never pass away over every kindred tongue and tribe. A kingdom that shall never pass away. And Steve says this passage must refer to the ascension of Christ. Well, more on that in a moment. Then he says, but this could hardly be the only coming of Christ, since no sooner had Jesus made this ascent than 2 angels immediately announced that there would yet be another coming, Acts 1, 10, 11, this time earthward. See, he assumes that this coming of Christ to the Ancient of Days in Daniel chapter 7 is upward to the Father, as in Acts chapter 1. Well, guess what? One scholar by the name of Holon has completely refuted that on grammatical grounds from Daniel chapter 7. Not only that, and I don't want to get too sidetracked on this, but according to Isaiah and according to Jeremiah, the Lord set his throne in Teman. Well, wait a minute. That's Yahweh set his throne in Teman. Teman's on earth. but God set his throne of judgment, and Daniel 7:13 and 14 is a judgment scene, a judgment of the little horn. And here we have the judgment of the little horn being described, and judgment was set. Well, where's the little horn? On earth. So the Lord setting his throne to judge the little horn is setting his throne on earth. And the bottom line is you can't make Daniel 7:13 and 14 refer to the ascension of Christ of Acts chapter 1, because the judgment of the little horn is at the coming of the Son of Man of Daniel chapter 7. Well, guess what? The little horn had not appeared, had not persecuted the saints, and was not being destroyed at the ascension of Christ in Acts chapter 1. So Steve Gregg makes some humongous assumptions, ignoring a total wealth of information in order to make his assertion about Acts chapter 1. More on Acts chapter 1 in just a moment. And then he says something, and this is what I was referring to when I said I've read it and I've reread it, and maybe I'm just a little thick here. But he says, the consistent application of the full preterist arbitrary hermeneutical rule of conflating all references to Christ's coming into one event would require that actually none of Jesus's references to his coming could possibly refer to AD 70. Daniel already originated the expression to speak of an earlier event, i.e. the ascension of Christ. The majority of predictions of Christ's coming are written after the ascension, which means that the first reference to a term in Daniel 7:13 cannot control all other references to the same term. Well, who said that the first reference controls all references? That's a little bit of an arbitrary rule. Now, I know people appeal to it all the time, the rule of first mention. I don't see that that rule is an inviolable rule. And Steve is making a false accusation, a false representation of the preterist view, saying, well, preterists believe that every single reference to the coming of the Lord has to be AD 70. Where did he read that? He didn't give a citation from any preterist about that supposed preterist hermeneutic. He just says, preterists say all references to the coming of the Lord are to the same event, AD 70. Once again, he didn't quote any preterist. He just made an accusation. And I suggest to you, that's a misrepresentation. So, he continues, what then is a full preterist to do with this arbitrary rule? Well, it would be an arbitrary rule. It is an arbitrary rule, and it's not the preterist rule. You see, this is misdirection. This is a straw man argument. Anyway, he, that is the full preterist, must in all honesty dispense with it as a failed hermeneutic. Well, it's not our hermeneutic. It is the mere clinging to this hermeneutic and nothing else that justifies full preterism's existence as a system separate from partial preterism. One would think that this information would warrant a crisis of faith for any full preterist. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me reiterate this. I don't know of a single preterist who says every single reference to the coming of the Lord must be AD 70. Every preterist that I'm aware of, well, I'm a little caveat here, I've seen some preterists make some pretty wild and illegitimate claims. So I won't say every preterist, but every knowledgeable preterist that I am aware of understands that, for instance, the Greek word parousia is a nuanced word. Paul used the Greek word parousia to speak of his own personal presence, physical presence. But he also used the word parousia to speak of the spiritual presence of Christ. Every preterist that I'm well aware of, every well-read preterist, is fully aware of that. So Gregg then asked, what other events might be referred to scripturally as Christ's coming? And he has this. In John's writing, Christ is occasionally said to come in a spiritual manner. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him and he with me. Well, amen. I don't know any preterists deny that. Compare this idea with the same usage in John's gospel. I will pray the Father, he will give you another helper, the Spirit of truth. I will not leave you orphans, I will come to you. Okay. Show me a preterist that denies that Jesus was saying he was going to come representatively through the presence of the Holy Spirit. Show me a preterist that denies that. And then he mentions temporal judgments upon nations or other entities are visitations from God. For the Lord is coming to judge the earth or land, Psalms 96. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt, Isaiah 19. For behold, the Lord is coming out of his place. He will come down and tread on the high places of the earth, Micah chapter 1 and verse 3. And on he gives other examples. And he says, in all the above cases, a specific case of judgment upon some identified nation, city, or church is threatened. None of these particular cases is speaking of the end of the world nor the end of Jerusalem in AD 70. I don't know of any preterist that claims that they are. Do you see how Steve Gregg is setting up a straw man here, ladies and gentlemen? Look, you set up a straw man, and it's real easy to blow it down, and you go, see, I've destroyed the preterist view. And then he says, the full preterists do not recognize this nuanced use of these terms any more than the futurist does. These camps paint only with a broad brush, seeing only one event in every occurrence of the terminology. Full preterists gratuitously conclude that since the destruction of Jerusalem seems to be referred to as a coming of the Lord in some places, the language must be applied to the same event in every instance. It can never refer to any event later than AD 70. Well, I would agree with that last statement. This is exegetically vacuous in light of the biblical evidence and simply represents a prejudicial a priori assumption of simplistic biblical interpreters. Now, there's a mouthful. In other words, full preterists are prejudiced, presuppositional, simplistic, biblical interpreters. It takes my friend, Steve Gregg, to correct us. Now, for the rest of my time today, I want to examine what Steve has to say about the, quote, the final parousia. Since the phraseology of the coming of the Lord might refer to any number of events, depending upon context, it is absurd to suggest that it cannot, in certain contexts, refer to a final event of judgment upon the whole world at the end of time. You see what he's done? He has slipped his own presuppositional, prejudiced eschatology into the book. He is assuming, oh, well, yeah, you got parousia used here and there and what have you, but that doesn't mean that there's not an end of the world. Well, the burden of proof therefore lies squarely upon Steve Gregg to prove that, okay, you have all of these usages of the word coming of the Lord, parousia, erchomai, epiphany, phanerao, etc., etc. You have all of these references that refer to non-end of time events. But, that doesn't mean there's not an end of time. Well, I agree. That alone doesn't mean there's not an end of time. But you don't assume it to be true. You don't just simply say over and over, as Steve Gregg does in the book, well, yeah, this is true, this is true, this is true, but those are not the end of the world passages. See, the burden of proof lies squarely on Steve Gregg to prove that the Bible teaches the end of the world. Now, he adduces two texts, and he says, two instances where the coming of Christ is seen as the end of the world, much more reasonably than the destruction of Jerusalem or any other historical event, are the references in Acts 1:11 and 1 Thessalonians 4:15-18. Now, I want you to understand what I'm about to do here, okay? I want you to understand that I'm going to employ Steve Gregg's own hermeneutic that he actually says is illegitimate, but that he employs over and over and over and over in this book. Okay? He admits it's illegitimate, and he says, I don't do that. But he does. Over and over and over. So, take heed. What I'm about to say is not a legitimate hermeneutic. It is Steve Gregg's hermeneutic that I'm turning on him, that I'm utilizing against him. Everybody got that? Okay? This is not my hermeneutic. It's Steve Gregg's that on the one hand he says, oh, it's illegitimate. I never, ever, ever use that hermeneutic. But in fact, this book is completely chock full of his use of this hermeneutic. Okay. So, what does he say? Where was I here? This is especially true of cases where the coming is said to be accompanied by events that have never occurred, like all the graves being emptied, corpses coming to life, etc., etc. Two instances where the coming of Christ is seen as the end of the world much more reasonably than the destruction of Jerusalem or any other historical event are references in Acts 1:11 and 1 Thessalonians 4:15-18. Now remember, what I'm about to say is not my hermeneutic, it's Steve Gregg's that he employs over and over in the book, but which he himself says is illegitimate. Steve Gregg says Acts 1 and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 far more reasonably refer to the end of the world. But wait, Acts 1:11 does not mention the end of the world. Acts 1:11 does not mention the end of the age. Acts 1:11 does not mention people coming out of the graves. It doesn't mention the resurrection. Now, mind you, later in the book, Steve Gregg will seek to delineate between passages. Okay, for instance, he delineates between Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, and John chapter 5, 28 and 29. You know why? Well, because John 5 uses the term graves. Daniel 12 doesn't. And thus, he says, they're talking about two different events, okay? So he's using what I call the missing word hermeneutic. So, using his own hermeneutic, he appeals to Acts 1 and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and says, these are end of the world passages. And yet, end of the world does not appear. The coming with angels does not appear in Acts 1. The coming with a shout is not there. The coming with the great trumpet or with the last trumpet of 1 Corinthians 15:52 is not found there. The passing of heaven and earth is not there. The new creation is not found there. Now remember, later in the book, Steve Gregg is going to make a distinction between text and say, well, this text over here may be AD 70, but this one is different because it doesn't use the same words. Well, okay. then that must mean Acts 1 cannot be the same as 1 Corinthians 15. Acts 1 cannot be the same as Revelation 21 and 22. Acts 1 cannot be the same coming as 2 Corinthians chapter 5. You see how false that hermeneutic is? But Steve's argument on Acts chapter 1 is, the same Jesus whom you have seen taken up from you shall come in like manner as you have seen him go. Well, you see the problem here, ladies and gentlemen, is using that term in like manner in some kind of a woodenly literalistic manner instead of the way that it is commonly used. For instance, that term that is translated in like manner is from the Greek term hon tropon. Same identical term is used in Matthew chapter 23, verse 37, when Jesus said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that kills the prophets, stones those who are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered you together as a mother hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not." The word "as" there is from the Greek term hon tropon, the same word used in Acts 1:11. Now, did Jesus mean to say precisely, literally, physically, like a mother hen gathers her chicks under her wings? I wanted to gather Israel to me? Well, you know that's false. Am I being facetious? Maybe a little, but not really. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 8, Paul was speaking of events of the last days that were happening in his day and time. And he says, "As Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, even so these," that's the scoffers that were alive and well in his day, "also withstand the truth. They are ever learning, but never coming to a knowledge of the truth," Paul said. Now, wait a minute. He said, "As Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses." Well, how did the magicians in Exodus withstand Moses? They performed, they cast down their rods and they became serpents. They performed some of the other plagues. So, unless you can prove that those men in Paul's day were performing the exact same and precise miracles as Jannes and Jambres did, then you got a problem. You see, the Greek term hon tropon doesn't mean exact, precise, physical likeness. Christ ascended in the clouds. He would come in the clouds with power and great glory in the first century generation, Matthew 24, 30 to 34. A passage which, by the way, Steve Gregg admits was fulfilled in AD 70. Now, consider very quickly, I'm running out of time. Consider very quickly. In Acts chapter 1, there was no shout, there was no trumpet, there was no resurrection, there were none of those things that are used in passages that Steve Gregg also applies to AD 70. Matthew 24, a shout, the great trumpet, the gathering of the elect. And yet Steve Gregg understands that those passages are AD 70. Now, consider the transfiguration. When Jesus was ascending, he still appeared to his apostles as that, may I use my terminology, as a 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body. But in the transfiguration vision of Matthew chapter 17, he was transfigured before his apostles in such a manifest, gloriously bright, brilliant, frightening manner that they were afraid almost to death. His face shined like the sun. His clothes shined whiter than white. Well, that's a vision of the second coming, according to Peter, in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 16. So let's see, how does this in like manner compare? Now, if you're going to say in like manner, he'll come exactly and precisely as you see him go, then that doesn't match the vision of the transfiguration, which was a vision of the second coming of Christ. See, there's something wrong here. There's not a one-to-one comparison between these two situations. And then, and that's all time I've got for that. He says, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Oh, by the way, here we are, another example of Steve Gregg's missing word hermeneutic, because he says of Acts chapter 1, there is no time text attached to this prediction. Well, what if the time text for the other references to Christ's coming, parousia, erchomai, phanerao, epiphania, what if the time text associated with them applies to Acts chapter 1? You see, you cannot arbitrarily, this gets back to hermeneutic, you cannot arbitrarily say, well, there's not a time text there, therefore there's no time text there. Wrong hermeneutic. Wrong hermeneutic. Now, no, I'm out of time. Okay? Sorry about that. The second passage that Steve adduces is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. I want to spend a little bit of time on that next week, and so I will call it an end there. I hope this has been helpful to you. I think you can see how flawed, inconsistent, self-contradictory Steve Gregg's own hermeneutic is. On the one hand, he says, you know what, just because given words, terms, or phrases are not found in given text does not mean that those texts cannot refer to the same text that use those same words, terms, and phrases. He's absolutely right. That would be an illegitimate hermeneutic to say, oh, missing words can't be the same over here. And yet, that is precisely the hermeneutic that Steve Gregg employs throughout his book. Boy, I have trouble doing that, don't I? Okay, again, thank you for joining me. And by the way, I have an extensive comparison between 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and the Olivet Discourse in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air. Steve Gregg denies that these are the same texts or the same subject. If you want to see an absolute, irrefutable demonstration they are speaking of the same thing, go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, order the book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, and I'll refund your shipping, and that will save you $5. Okay, thank you again for joining me. You have a fantastic and safe weekend. I'll see you on Monday.